Chapter 9 of 1 Corinthians, chapter 8, we talked about this issue of this idols, eating this meat offered to idols, and how while it was not sinful in and of itself, anything that violates our conscience is sinful because of what it does to the conscience. And so we can't violate our own consciences, and therefore as Christians we shouldn't do those things that, even though they may not bother ours, if they bother someone else's enough to cause them to sin. And that's the difference here too in this chapter. The concern was for these people that had come out of paganism, that for those that understood, look, there's no such thing as gods, other gods. There's only the one God. Therefore these idols of wood and stone and metal don't mean anything, which we all understand that. They don't. If you go to another country and you see, quote, an idol, it doesn't bother you. You're not scared of it. And so there were some whose knowledge was such that, yeah, it didn't bother them. Therefore, they could buy the meat that was sacrificed to idols after it was sold in the marketplace. They could eat it in their homes. They might even go and eat it after the worship was over. It didn't bother them. But for others it did. And the problem was, if the others who had the weak conscience saw the stronger brothers and sisters eating it, and it caused them to eat it, influenced them enough for them to eat it and caused them to sin, well, then the stronger brothers and sisters needed to, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something. Something our state legislature doesn't understand. Just because you have a supermajority doesn't mean you should just do everything that pops into your head. But politics aside, that's true for individuals as well. And so the difference in that and saying, okay, somebody in the congregation comes up here and says, well, I don't like this or that. I'm offended. A lot of people say, well, what do we do when somebody's offended at everything? Well, the question is what you're doing going to cause them to sin? Not that they're just offended. We know we live in a society nowadays where everybody wears their feelings out on their sleeves, and everybody's offended about everything, and nobody gets up in the morning and puts their big boy britches on anymore. And so everybody's offended. Well, that's not the question here. What these people were doing was actually causing their brothers and sisters to sin, because they would go ahead and partake as well. They would feel, well, if he's doing it, I guess I should do it or can do it, and then it violated their conscience. And this whole section, chapter 7 through 11 or so, deals with matters of indifference, matters of opinion, but we have to be careful about those whom it bothers, and so that we don't lead them to do something that violates their conscience. And so chapter 9 is in the same context, and yet he kind of mixes in here this discussion where he talks about things that he was free to do, but yet he did not assert his rights to do them because he didn't want to cause any problem there in the church at Corinth. And so it leads also into a discussion of even here of paying the preachers. But notice, let's begin in verse 1 and read the first couple of verses. Am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord? If I am not an apostle to others, yet doubtless I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. Well, obviously there was, and we've talked about this before, you get in these sections like chapter 7 and 8 where he starts out the chapters now concerning. What he's doing is obviously responding to some inquiries that these people had in a previous correspondence. And obviously he's got some detractors in Corinth who are even questioning his apostleship. And why would you, if you lived in that day and age, why would you question Paul's apostleship? What's different about Paul's apostleship? Well, yeah, he didn't, well, he wasn't with the original 12 following Jesus around from day to day for 3.5 years. As he says in another place, he was one born out of due season. He came along later, and so there were some that questioned, because maybe they didn't like him or what he was teaching, they questioned his apostleship as well. But the key qualification of an apostle, of course, is given to us in Acts chapter 1. When Matthias was appointed, Peter said they had to be what? They had to be witnesses of Jesus from the beginning, from the baptism of John until he was what? Till he ascended. So they had to be, the primary qualification for an apostle was to be a witness of what in particular? Resurrection. Well, was Paul a witness of the resurrection? Absolutely. That was the whole reason that Jesus appeared on the road to Damascus to him. Not to save him. He was told to go into Damascus and somebody else would tell him what to do to be saved. But he appeared to him so that he could qualify him to send him to the Gentiles. And so you get this emphasis in Acts. 3 times in Acts we're told that Jesus appeared to him. Well, someone else might say, well, where did he get his? He's inferior to the others, and he had to have the others, kind of teach him and fill him in. He didn't get his gospel from Jesus like they did. Well, what did he say in Galatians chapter 1? He said, to reveal when it pleased God who separated me from my mother's womb and called me by his grace to reveal his Son in me, that I might preach him among the heathen. Immediately I conferred not with flesh and blood, neither went I up to Jerusalem to them which were apostles before me, but I went where? Into Arabia, and returned again unto Damascus. Then after 3 years, he said, I didn't see any apostles until I was in Arabia for 3 years. Well, what was he doing? How long were the other apostles with Jesus? 3 years, 3.5. How long was Saul off in the desert of Arabia? About 3 years after his conversion. He briefly goes back to Damascus where they tried to snag him, and he escapes there, let down through a wall. And so his training came from who? He said, I didn't get this gospel from man, right? Wasn't revealed to me by others. Verses 11 to 12 of Galatians 1. I received it by revelation of Jesus Christ. He was personally trained. And so he says, am I not free? Well, considering the context of meats and other discussions of freedom, he says, I've got the same rights as other Christians, but I don't always take advantage of those rights if it's not for their benefit. But you who are attacking me, am I not an apostle? He said, are you not my work in the Lord? I mean, who established this church? Paul did. It was he that brought him to the truth. And if I'm not an apostle to others, yet doubtless I am to you. For you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. What was his seal? What was the seal of his apostleship? What could apostles do that nobody else could do? Not miracles. Others could do miracles. Yes. Are you not my seal? Are you not the seal of my apostleship in the Lord? Did I not confer upon you spiritual gifts? What more proof would you need of my apostleship? He had that ability just like the other apostles. A seal is that which proves, confirms, authenticates. And this church was proof that he was an apostle because he had bestowed these miraculous abilities on them. 1 Corinthians, go back to chapter 1. Remember, verses 5 through 7. In everything you're enriched by him, in all utterance and all knowledge, even as the testimony of Christ was confirmed in you, so that you come behind in no gift. And if you go into 2 Corinthians chapter 12, he says, what is it wherein you were inferior to other churches? Except that I was not burdensome to you. Forgive me this wrong. He obviously had imparted miraculous abilities to them. And so they were living proof of his apostleship. Let's pick up in verse 3. My defense, I think the King James says my answer, but defense is a better word here in the New King James and American Standard, because that's that Greek word apologia, from which we get our word apology, but the English word apology is not really the definition of that Greek word anymore, but it means defense, hence apologetics. My defense to those who examine me is this: do we have no right to eat and drink? Do we have no right to take along a believing wife, as do also the other apostles, the brothers of the Lord, and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working? Whoever goes to war at his own expense, who plants a vineyard and does not eat of its fruit, or who tends a flock does not drink of the milk of the flock? Well, he's going to give a verbal defense, and so he's determined to defend his apostleship. That word for power there, of course, in the New Testament generally means what? This is not the word dunamis, okay? But this is the word that means permission, authority. You remember the Sanhedrin asked the apostles, by what power or in what name are you proclaiming these things? Well, they meant, but what's your authority? So it's a different Greek word there, but it would appear that perhaps one of the arguments that the Corinthians who didn't like Paul were using against him was, well, he doesn't take support from us. And so if he's not going to take support from us, then he knows that he's not really an apostle, you see. Or else he'd take the support. Well, as you go throughout this text, then he reinforces to them, well, I have a right to take it, but I chose to do something different. I chose to supply my own needs and work and supply, or work with my own hands to supply my support. And so he's talking about what he and other preachers have a right to do, and he's going to tell us these are God-ordained rights. And by the way, what does he mean here? Do we have no right to eat and drink? Do we have no right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles, the brothers of the Lord, and Cephas, Peter? Peter had a wife. Remember, his mother-in-law was sick. So this idea that Peter was the first pope is ludicrous, yeah. So what does he mean by that? Well, don't I have a right? Don't Barnabas and I have a right? By the way, by the time this was written, were Paul and Barnabas together? Huh? No. No, they'd parted ways. You see any animosity in Paul's writing toward Barnabas? Respect for Barnabas. They disagreed about John Mark, but that didn't affect the rest of their relationship. So what does he mean? Do I not have a right to take along a wife? Well, if I had a wife, I might also have what? Family. Guess what, church? I have a right not only to be supported myself, but what? For you to support my family. Yeah. Just like the other apostles. Jude and James, and Peter. You have to support them too. Take along a believing wife. That's a different translation, I believe, from the King James, which says a sister, a wife. Other translations have taken that to mean, the American Standard says a believing wife, I think, and the New King James says a wife who is a believer. There are some commentators that believe that that's not really the same thing. I mean, that word for sister could be translated a real sister. You say, well, I might be taking care of a sister. not just a wife. But it could be a believing wife. But either way, Paul says you have to support my family too. All the needs that I have or that the minister of Christ has. And of course, we can assume or we can draw from this text that there were other apostles that were married. The Lord's brothers were married. And it also means the Lord's brothers were receiving support, not just the apostles in their preaching ministries. So, or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working? Of course, Paul made tents while he was there in Corinth, but he claims the right to be supported. And it would appear that he was right in probably not taking the support with all the detractors. He didn't want them saying, you're just doing it for the money. But they accepted the fact that the others could receive it. Why would Paul and Barnabas be excluded? Well, apparently Barnabas refused to accept wages too when he was there. It's interesting, the generosity of Barnabas. This would kind of fit into with his character. If Barnabas refused to take pay from them too, that kind of goes back to Acts 4. What was he doing in Acts 4? Yeah, he was selling his own property, giving it to support those brethren in Jerusalem that had become Christians and hadn't gone back home after the Feast of Pentecost. So, just seemed to kind of fit with Barnabas' character.
Brother Greg,
Yeah.
somebody like Paul, his work required humility and humble, and he went about his work while he was at Corinth. The worst thing that a man like that would have to do is defend himself. He doesn't want to talk about his qualities and his rights, but when you get pushed to this point, that's really bad, when a preacher has to defend himself.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. And the fact of the matter is, a preacher and anyone has a right to defend their work and their record. Paul did. I mean, when you get pushed to that point, you have a right to defend yourself. He gives 3 illustrations here, which are all interesting as they relate to the church. Whoever goes to war. That's one word in the Greek, strategai. I don't know how you say it, but you ever played that game? You ever heard of the word strategy? When you were a kid, you ever play the game? I used to have a game called Stratego. Didn't everybody ever play that? Board game. Strategy. Whoever goes to war, literally could be translated, serves as a soldier. Well, whoever goes to war serves as a soldier at his own expense. Well, do soldiers get paid or not? Who plants a vineyard does not eat of its fruit? Or who tends a flock and does not drink of the milk of the flock? Well, it's interesting, those 3 illustrations. Are Christians ever referred to as soldiers in the New Testament? 2 Timothy 2, endure hardness. Paul told Timothy as a what? Good soldier? Are the people of God, the church, ever referred to as a vineyard? Luke chapter 20. Matthew 21, we labor in the vineyard. Right? What about a flock? Christians ever called sheep? Yeah, Matthew 25. And the preacher helps provide spiritual nourishment for those sheep. Interesting comparisons. I don't know, I've never really, it's not really fun being compared to a sheep. Those are dumb animals. But we're sheep. Say I these things as a man? Do I say these things as a mere man? Or does not the law say the same also? Now, first he gives 3 illustrations. Then he goes to the law of Moses and the principles we can learn from there. For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. Where's that from? Deuteronomy 25:4. This is not simply human reasoning here, but this is straight from the law of God. Is it oxen God is concerned about? Well, yeah, somewhat. I mean, that question is not meant to say He doesn't care about oxen at all. Now, certainly God cares about His creation, but does He care about oxen compared to those created in His image? No. No. Not anywhere close. And so, is it written just for them, for animals? No. Or does He say it all together for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt, this is written that he who plows should plow in hope, and he who threshes in hope should be partaker of his hope. If we have sown spiritual things for you, is it a great thing if we reap your material things, which is a better translation than carnal? Material things. If others are partakers of this right over you, are we not even more? Well, again, does the law of Moses say you have to pay the preacher a living wage? Find that verse for me. No, what's he saying? What does Romans say? The things that were written aforetime were what? Written for our learning. There are principles there. And one of those principles, Paul says, is paying the preacher. How did the priests live in the Old Testament? What did they partake of? Sacrifices off the altar. It was all divvied up between the priests, the Levites, and God. Steak every night. Well, maybe they might have had lamb some nights. You know. Maybe some barbecue goat. But at any rate, the principles apply. God demands humane treatment for animals. It applies to His highest creation. And so He's talking about specifically the preachers here. If we've sown unto you spiritual things, well, which is more valuable? Which is more valuable? The material or the spiritual things? Who actually was sowing the more valuable things? Paul was, wasn't he? I mean, he was giving them something that would lead to eternal life. I mean, physical foods for this world, but, you know, Jesus said in Matthew 4, man shall not live by what? Bread alone. It's that Word of God, what comes from His mouth, that sustains us for eternity. So, Paul says, if we're going to sow you spiritual things, then is it a great thing if we reap material things? If others are partakers of this right over you, are we not even more? Well, apparently they were supporting other teachers. So what's wrong with me? He was basically their father in the faith. The other guys would have been Johnny-come-lately, so to speak. No, not intending to disparage anybody, but they did come after him. You know, you reckon after Paul goes through all these arguments, look at the soldier. You know, look at the vineyard. Look at the shepherd and the sheep. And then look at what God said in the Old Testament. After he goes through all of that, do you think by this time in the whole discourse that the Corinthians were thinking, I know what's coming next. What's coming next? What would you think's coming next? If a preacher got up here one day and started preaching on the support of preachers, what do you think's coming next? Hey, I need some support. Would be a fair guess, right? Well, but he doesn't. Notice what he says. Nevertheless, we have not used this right, but endure all things. I think the King James says suffer, but keep it in the context. He's talking about working and proclaiming the gospel. We endure all things lest we hinder the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who minister the holy things eat of the things of the temple? We just mentioned that. And those who serve at the altar partake of the offerings of the altar. Even so, the Lord has... Now, the King James says ordained. Maybe the American Standard does too, but I like the New King James translation here because this is what it means. Even so, the Lord has commanded that those who preach of the gospel should live from the gospel. We are commanded to support preachers and teachers of the gospel. It's not optional. Paul says, look, I didn't want to cause any problems there, so I didn't take it. But this is the normal rule. It is the ideal for the preacher to give full devotion and attention to his work of teaching and preaching. That's the ideal. Now, there are places preachers go that are missionaries, that are mission fields. Maybe the Lord's church is very small, and he has to work a secular job to support his family and preach. There's no question that has to happen sometimes. But that is not the ideal. If there's enough people in the congregation to support him, the ideal is for him to do this work full time. Yeah.
If he personally decided you're not going to support me, then why this effort to describe the importance of it?
Well, obviously the effort was for others. I mean, I think part of it. Obviously, some of the effort's for us, right? The word was going to be left for us. But also, I think he's also defending himself to them. You know, keep in mind, he's saying, look, you know, y'all got a beef with me? You don't think I'm a real apostle because I didn't take support? Yes, you're required. You have to support, but I didn't take it from you. And he's going to go on later and he says, even later in the text, maybe I was wrong in doing that. I'm sure Paul felt good inside. Do you feel good when you do something for somebody and don't expect anything in return? Does that make you feel good? I'm sure it made Paul feel good. But on the other hand, sometimes you need to take into account, are you really helping that person or not? Right? We'll talk about that a little later in the text. Is that really what's best for them? For them to get out of not paying?
Hey, Greg.
Yeah.
You know, there's also the sort of the flip side of the coin of that when you are receiving your income that way, not always, sometimes just being cautious about saying certain things. And you look at what he had to say to the Corinthians.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
And the thing is that you're always going to get people, some that say, well, you're saying this because we're paying, and then others are saying, well, you're saying this because we're not paying you.
Yeah.
You're always in a no-win situation.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, well, they're paying me, I better watch what I say. Paul didn't want to have to watch what he said with these people. And hold that thought, because I want to come back to that here in just a minute. Let's finish this phrase, because I want to point out too that the Jew, now he's writing to a Gentile church primarily. So when he starts talking about people living from the offerings in the temple, this was not just a Jewish thing. We're not just talking about the temple in Jerusalem and the Israelites and their priests living, but the pagan world did that too. I mean, they were very familiar with this. If you went to a pagan temple, you paid, and they got part of the sacrifices, the priest did, right? So they were very familiar. It didn't matter whether you were Jew or pagan, it worked the same in both temples. As far as the priest and those serving at the altar getting part of the deal. So, and I think the point you bring up is good. Look, this is obviously not the only context that talks about this. You know, Matthew 10, 9 and 10, Jesus told those that he sent out, look, you don't take anything with you. They're going to support you wherever you go, right? Same thing in Luke 10. Galatians 6, let him that is taught in the word communicate share with him that teacheth. 1 Timothy 5, don't muzzle the ox that treads out the grain. Let the elders that rule well be counted of double honor. So this principle is on and is mentioned several times in the New Testament. But the point I want to make, and I think it ties in with yours, Dave, is that it's not just about pay, but it's adequate pay. Okay. I was thinking about this on the way over here. A few years ago, and it's been several years ago, I remember when I heard some people talking about, I don't know if they were talking or grumbling, I don't remember. But they were talking about this large church in Nashville being the first church in the Brotherhood that was going to pay a preacher $100,000. They couldn't believe it. Well, I think this church had about 2,000 members. So, I didn't think much about it at the time, but I've thought about that more over the years. And I've thought about, what is our idea? Some people have the idea of paying the preacher is he's supposed to live at a subsistence level. We just give him barely enough to get to work and back home. And yet we're all living just fine, right? It always seems to me that the preacher ought to be making pretty much the median income of something, whatever church he's working for. He ought to be part of the same bunch. But there are churches who have, over the years, well, I've heard people tell me about places they went where they just wouldn't pay the preachers. They couldn't get anybody. Somehow didn't understand that, he's got to live too, and his family, And his kids want to play Little League, and his kids want to, take karate or whatever. I don't know, whatever you do, whatever your family's into. I mean, they want to have family things. They want to go on vacation. So the more I thought about this $100,000 deal, I said, well, wait a minute. That's a big church. Probably got some people there making a lot of money. I don't know that that's so out of the ordinary or strange. In fact, I thought about, and this is where it dovetails into your point. Let's say we have 250 people here today for worship. On an average Sunday, how many toes does the preacher step on? I don't know. But let's say it's 10%. Let's say out of 250 people, he steps on 10% of the toes. There's 25 people here that come out, I didn't care for that one today. 250 toes. Well, multiply that by 10. Suppose you're a preacher at a 2,000 or 2,500 member congregation. How many toes did you step on this Sunday? 10%. Well, maybe you should get paid more. Because instead of 25 people on your case, now you got what? You got 250 people on your case. I don't know. I was just kind of thinking about that as I came in. There's some responsibility there. In fact, all preachers of the gospel have the same responsibility to preach the truth and do so with a proper attitude. But here's a guy, he's delivering it to 10 times more as this guy. I don't know. $100,000 doesn't sound like a whole lot to me.
The thing about it is, the preacher doesn't just do this Sunday morning, Sunday night, or Wednesday night.
No.
He's busy all week.
Yeah, he's getting paid for the entire thing, no question. And I think because of the stickiness of this is a subject that a lot of preachers, they avoid. You don't want to act like you're just in it for the money, right? Or that you're just asking for money. And so because preachers don't want to preach about it, it doesn't get taught. Therefore, congregations may not understand their obligations. So it's kind of a catch-22, vicious cycle.
Some of it probably comes out of the old vow poverty stuff.
Yeah, and some of it may be even a denominational thing. These guys they're not Franciscan monks. Not our preachers. They didn't take some vow of poverty, and cut their hair and look like Martin Luther, with a big bald spot in the middle. But again, in the context, Paul's talking about rights he could have asserted that he didn't. And then you get a spiraling effect if we don't pay them and we don't treat them like we should. Then what happens as far as getting more preachers? How many parents want their son to grow up and be a preacher? How many parents want their daughters to marry a preacher? Because he's not going to be able to keep her in, what she's accustomed to. What daddy could give her. Right? It becomes a bad cycle. And just because we're paying him doesn't mean, on the flip side, I think, again, this goes back to what Dave said, doesn't mean we can order him around. And tell him, you can't preach this, don't preach that, we don't like, well, he's got to preach the whole counsel of God. So again, Paul, we can see some reasons why Paul didn't want their money. He didn't want to have that kind of, issue. And he says in verse 15, though, "But I have used none of these things, nor have I written these things that it should be done so to me." I'm not writing all this to make you, and I'm not going to ask you for money. "For it would be better for me to die than that anyone should make my boasting void. For if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of, for necessity is laid upon me. Yes, woe is me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this willingly, I have a reward. But if against my will," literally, that could be translated, "For if I do this willingly, I have a reward. But if unwillingly," there's a play on words in the Greek. They're almost the same word, willingly and unwillingly. "I have been entrusted with a stewardship. What is my reward then? That when I preach the gospel, I may present the gospel of Christ without charge, that I may not abuse my authority in the gospel." Well, he's going to give them an explanation then why he hadn't taken support from them. And what I'm writing about, he says, has nothing to do with me. I'd rather be dead than be robbed of my independence. But not every preacher's in that circumstance that Paul was. So he says necessity is laid upon me. What's this necessity, you think? Couple things possibly here. When Jesus appeared to Paul on the road, and when he talked to Ananias, but when he appeared to Paul on the road, did Paul have a choice to become a Christian? Absolutely. He had a choice. He could say yes or no. But Jesus told Ananias, "Look, I have picked him purposely. And I'm going to show him how much he must suffer for my name. He's going to take this gospel to the Gentile world. He's a chosen vessel." So, two ideas here, I think. Number one, he says it was of necessity. He was given a charge and obligation directly from the Lord. This is what the rest of your life is going to be about, starting today. Now, Paul could have refused it, but had he refused it, what does he say would have happened to him? Woe! Most commentators see that as eternal damnation. Well, what happens to anybody that rejects Christ? Woe!
Well, he had done nothing but kill people anyway, so yes, he was condemned, or he accepted it, or he went.
Well, and again, I think that's you've alluded to the second point. This necessity could come from the outside. That is, the Lord Himself has given you this responsibility. Now, are you going to take it? Are you going to accept it? Are you going to do it? That's one side of it. But the other side of it was probably internal. I can imagine a man who's been killing Christians, persecuting Christians, once he finds out he's wrong, there is a strong internal motivation to try to, in some small way, undo what you've done. And so this necessity could very well come from both sides, internal and external. Well, we didn't do too bad. We'll finish chapter 9 and get into chapter 10 next week. Yep. Yeah, that is, according to one of the verses I just mentioned. Timothy says they're worthy of double honor. That means they're entitled to be paid if they're doing the work of an evangelist. If they're full, if an elder, and I've known the churches to pay one that was in charge of, he worked there every day like the preacher, taught, in charge of all kinds of ministries and programs. We don't do that here, but it's scriptural.